So before I dive into this information, I just want to highlight that the term services in the global kind of that global idea of special education is really broad, and it covers a lot of different things like assistive technology, transportation, paraprofessional support. And so this particular training is focused specifically on that services grid on the IEP. But I want to just highlight that services in an IEP are more than just what's on that grid. So, kind of with that background knowledge in mind, we're going to jump into the bottom line when it comes to documenting services, any type of service on an IEP. And so, the compliance that we, are working under from the federal and state government have to do with services, both special education and related, that they're described in the IEP and that they meet the student's needs. And then they also have to include these specific components. So, the type of service, which includes the frequency, how many minutes per session, the duration, and the setting. Also, the services need to be connected to a goal, but each service doesn't have to have its own goal. So that's just something to clarify. You can have one goal connected to more than one service. And then there needs to be categorical consultation as indirect service if the case manager is not licensed in the student's primary disability. So we're going to go through kind of how this looks on an IEP. And thankfully, this is where I think our paperwork actually is helpful because we have, this grid that explains kind of what things look like that really meet several of these requirements. So again, services is a global term. And the way that I kind of like to think about the IEP process is that we figure out what a student needs. And then we hone in specifically on the skills that they need to be working on, and that's where our goals come from. And then the services are actually what we're going to be doing or providing the student in order to help them reach those goals. And so here are some questions for you to kind of think about as you start putting together a service plan for a student. The next thing, if you've done a services grid, seen a services grid, you're likely going to notice that we have direct and indirect services listed. And so I want to just call out the differences between those. So a direct service is a instruction or a service that is provided to a child by a provider. So it's like, co-teaching could be an example, small group, large group instruction. It doesn't always have to be in the special education setting. I think it typically is, but it's related to kind of a need on the students, on the student's IEP, obviously, and it's that provider to student direct interaction. An indirect service is when a special education teacher related service provider is providing kind of behind the scenes consult to usually it's to a case manager, but it could be to kind of anyone who's working with the student. So an example would be occupational therapy might come in a couple times a year to provide some tips and tricks to help a student with a fine motor goal or a fine motor need. So that would be listed as an indirect service because they're not providing direct service to the student. The other thing I mentioned a little bit earlier was just this cross-categorical case management. So if a student's primary disability is different than what their case manager is licensed in, we need to have that documented on this services grid as indirect consultation service. And so then if you're wondering, well, I'm not licensed in an autism spectrum disorder, but I have a student on my caseload who has that as their disability, who can I, pull in to provide this consultation? These licensing grids are linked here. We usually go over them at least once a year and update them and make sure that they're accurate. The next thing are the start dates and end dates. And so just a couple of key points to call out here. The start date has to be at least 14 calendar days after the date that's listed on the prior written notice. And the reason for that is it allows parents that adequate time to accept or reject what is being proposed. So we want to just make sure that we're giving them that full 14 days to accept or reject the proposal because they're offered that by law. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And then the end date, this doesn't print on the IEP, but it's kind of helpful sometimes just to kind of have that information available. Most of the time, I would say the vast majority of the time, the end date is going to be 1 year after the start of the IEP, but every once in a while you run into circumstances. For example, if a student is graduating, their end date would probably not be 1 calendar year. It might be a little bit shorter than that. Or if a student is receiving, support for a semester and the IEP team has determined that at the end of the semester they're no longer going to have that service. Things like that can sometimes pop up where it would be less than a year, but usually it is 1 year. And then service provider numbers. So we typically try to update these again at least once a year in the fall. And this just kind of doesn't really maybe have a direct impact on you as a case manager. But when we do reporting that we're required to do, and we do a lot of work behind the scenes on some of those things, these service provider numbers help us to capture the services that are being provided and who's providing them. And so I'll go through in just a second and demonstrate how you can enter that information in. Last thing on this resource page are just some frequently asked questions that I'm not going to go through each of these, but there might be something here that you experience and would want to get some more information on. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to kind of show you what this looks like in SpEd forms. And I have a student scenario that we're going to go over. So the first thing I'm going to do is open up my student in SpEd forms. And I'm going to go to the student's IEP. And in the IEP, I am talking specifically about the services that are listed on page 1. And so what I am talking about is specifically that services grid. And so I think it's going to be, it's not even showing up on here. So I'll show you in just a second. I don't have anything in there right now. That's what I'm going to demonstrate. So that's why it's not in there. But here is the student scenario that we're going to be working through. And actually, I'm not going to go through every single one of these services, but we'll go through a couple, and then we'll work on kind of documenting that indirect consultation. So point to note, the prior written notice is dated October 10th of 2023. So, sorry, and the student has needs in these particular areas, and the IEP team has determined that these following direct services, and doesn't say this explicitly, but these are going to take place in the special education setting. So these are the services that are going to be provided. So I'm going to work right now to document those language arts services. So the way that I do this is I access this page, and I'm going to make sure that I'm under special education and related services. So I'm not putting it down here because this is for ESY, but you'll see there's nothing here. So what I need to do then is I need to add a service, and then you'll see this populate, and it looks real similar to the ESY stuff. So that's how it can be a little bit confusing. But I'm going to be putting in language arts instruction. And again, that's going to be in the special education setting. And I'm going to be the provider, but I don't know my provider number, so I'm going to look it up. And so I pop that little box open and I checked my own name and my provider number populates. And then I believe this was 5 times a week. I think we said 40 minutes. Yep, 5 times a week for 40 minutes. So no indirect minutes and 40 minutes direct. And we're going to do this for a year. And then my start date, remember, is going to be at least 14 days. So the earliest it could be would be October 24th. Could be the 25th. You could even put the 30th if you wanted to, but it has to be at least 14 days after that date of the prior written notice. So I'm going to go with 10/24/2023, and then my end date would be 1 year after that. So I'm going to do this one more time, and I'm going to do this for the math instruction. And I'm going to show you how I could do this and put in a different provider number because maybe I'm not teaching math. So I'm going to add a service. And I'm going to choose the service that I want, which in this case is math instruction. This will be provided in the special education setting. And so now I'm not the provider. My colleague Jen Danielson is, but I don't know her provider number. So I clicked on that little people blue icon. I'm going to type in her name, and there she is. And so I'm going to select her, and then it puts her provider number in there. And we don't fill out the supervisor section. And I believe, I keep talking, I can't remember what the services are, 3 times a week, or maybe you get interrupted 100 times, right? And you don't remember, for 20 minutes. And then we're going to do this for a year. And this was 10/24. And then the end date would be a year from that date. Okay, so that is kind of just a demonstration about how to do these specific services. And then the last thing, we document it the same way, but the rationale for it is, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'm going to do ESY video next. The kind of how to document those indirect consult minutes. So in this example, the student's primary disability area is ASD. His case manager is licensed in EBD and LD. And so we're going to do that indirect consultation 4 times a year for 30 minutes. So, back to the services page, again, I will add a service. And we're going to, this one is autism spectrum disorder consultation, which is way at the bottom. A lot of the consultation, oops, did I pass it? No, I lost myself. Nope, here it is, autism spectrum disorder consultation. And we'll do that in special education. And that provider is going to be, we'll do Kate Krasinski. There she is. And that's going to happen, we said 4 times a year. And that's going to be 30 minutes a time and no direct minutes. And in these where you have 0, you can leave them blank or put a number in. It doesn't, either way is fine. And then we're going to do this for a year and so on and so forth. So I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to show you what this looks like, just so you can kind of have that frame of reference. So here are my services. And obviously I didn't put a start date in for those consultation services, and that's why it didn't populate there.